Welcome, everyone. My name is Hannah Rauhanen, and I'm the Ottawa Campus Manager and Program Advisor. We are thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar on nutrition and mental health. Paul Demeda is a graduate of IHN and has taught a variety of courses in the diploma program for 17 years. He works as a program facilitator for the International Society for Orthomolecular Medicine and runs a private nutrition consulting practice. He teaches 2 continuing education courses with IHN, Nutrition and Mental Health and Clinical Detoxification. Today, Paul will be lecturing on how nutrition affects mental health, the 5 key factors that have the greatest impact on supporting or damaging mental health, and so much more. I'll now let Paul share more about himself and the upcoming course before he begins his lecture.
Thanks, Hannah. And so I'm happy to be here today to talk about mental health. One of the passions of mine is mental health, and it has started way back when. I spent over 10 years working with people at the Davignon Digestive Health Center and also at the Wellness Institute as the holistic nutritionist there. I've seen well over 800 people. I got to say, in the last 5 years or so, majority of those people are coming for mental health reasons. And I originally really wasn't all that interested in mental health because I didn't think there was a lot that could be done. I attended my first continuing ed. It was actually for doctors on nutrition and mental health, nutrition of the brain. And I saw all these biochemical pathways that were affected and the results that were getting done in the clinical trials. And then I suddenly realized, hey, there's something that can be done. And that became very exciting to me. And then for some reason or another, more and more people with health issues gravitated towards working with me. And lots and lots and lots of experience there. So I have been practicing for well over 10 years, and I have been teaching at IHN. I taught the full-time program, and then now, because of other duties I'll tell you in a second about, I have just gone to the continuing eds a couple times a year, mental health and clinical detox. I work for the International Society for Orthomolecular Medicine. I'm program facilitator there, and I have a lot of different roles and have done many projects over the last year and a bit. One of them is to update Abram Hoffer's groundbreaking book on schizophrenia. And you can see a copy of the finished version up on the shelf there. It's called Light on Schizophrenia. Basically, what we did was we took Abram Hoffer's original book, which was a lot of clinical talk and a lot of our clinical experience and case studies, and interspersed the information that supports that and enhances that book and expands on it. So it was quite a project, took over a year and a bit to complete, but well worth it. One of the things that happens when you go and research schizophrenia and develop protocols and understanding of it is schizophrenia is probably considered the very far end of mental health issues, encompasses the most factors. And so if you understand schizophrenia, you understand to a degree every other mental health condition out there, most of them. So that was one of the projects I did for ISOM. We are currently working on mental health pages for the general public for our website. And so far we are set to release a page on anxiety and another one on schizophrenia, and the upcoming soon will be depression, and we have a bunch of other mental health issues, and so we're covering them from the perspective of somebody who may have schizophrenia or know somebody who has schizophrenia, and also from the perspective that they were to print the page out, take it to their doctor, the doctor would read it and say, okay, this is well done, well cited, well researched. Maybe I could implement some of these things. There's also several other projects I'm working on at the same time, there always is. And so that's it. So I have left teaching, and I still work in, except for the continuing eds. And I still work with clients regularly. and am also working on projects. So I've never left really the realm of mental health and nutrition since I started way back when. So, okay, let's get started with the lecture. And I'm just going to bring up my screen. And away we go. So today's talk is called The 5 Most Important Issues You Must Consider When Working with Mental Health Issues. And so these are the 5 most important things that come up over and over again that I have compiled and look at all the time and basically use as a starting point. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of give you not so much a step-by-step of how to address mental health issues, but more for setting up the context of what is mental health and how do you address it, give you an idea of how complex it can be, and give you some tools, ways of looking at the whole mental health issue so that you can basically look at it in a different way, in a better way. Most of the content for this comes from this conference in San Diego in 2019 that I was privileged enough to get into. Mostly medical doctors, very expensive for the, it was 4 days, 32 different speakers, so each an hour. So very, very intensive, but also really, really cool. I've been busy like crazy with all of my other projects and wanted to extract the information that I got from this conference and at some point, and so I used this webinar as a tool for extracting that information. So this is a small proportion of the 32 hours of lectures, but it is the good stuff that's relevant for what we do. So what is mental illness? And it kind of looks like this. Conventional medicine's approach to mental illness is it's a dysfunction of the way people think, the way people perceive, and then that kind of gets nailed down to a neurotransmitter deficiency. And so that's the model. And you'll see there's no nutrition there. There's no other confounding factors tied there. Basically, for the most part, that is what's considered to be the driver of all negative health issues, mental health issues. One of the speakers at the conference was Dr. Amen. I was excited to be able to see him because he was one of the main people who got me on the path of teaching mental health and approaching mental health in a different way. And I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, just as I started teaching mental health, nutrition and mental health as a continuing ed. And I was listening to his audio tapes and I realized that, wow, I got to completely change my course. And yeah, so it's pretty good. Here's the key thing. This is from his YouTube video, which is still up. The most important lesson from 83,000 brain scans. So basically, Dr. Amen does what is called the SPECT scans, and they look for deficiencies of function, or the scan will show where there is less brain function. So what he did is he looked at people who are coming in with mental health issues, brain trauma, schizophrenia, pretty much everything. And he would scan the brains of all of them. And after a while, he would see there were certain deficiencies in brain function. So inactivity in certain regions tied to different conditions. So brain scans is essentially the first time medicine actually looked at something, we'll say solid, when it comes to mental health, brain health, as opposed to just diagnosing with symptoms and things like that. So diagnosing or looking at the brain with a SPECT scan is equivalent of looking at a swollen leg with an X-ray to see that it's broken. Finally, there's something solid there. So now we have a solid connection to the brain dysfunction as a cause or driver of mental health issues, not just the thoughts and perceptions. So here's his quote based on by 2019, he'd done 160,000 brain scans. And so he says most psychiatric illnesses are not mental health issues, they are brain health issues. And that's an important issue. I can tell you from my experience, it's the brain, it's the molecules, we'll get into that, and it's not the mental side. There is a component of that, but you have to consider the brain as the organ of perception and thoughts. And so there we go. So when your brain works right, your mind works right, get your brain right and the mind will follow. And so that's also Dr. Amen. And I can tell you from experience over and over and over again, this is true. When you build that context that holds the thoughts and perceptions, when you build the brain, the thoughts and perceptions change. So from the holistic perspective, mental health is a dysfunction of brain composition, so what it's made of, how it's built, the structure, the chemistry. The immune system is strongly tied to brain health. Thoughts and perceptions are there. Thoughts and perceptions can be a result of the 4 things above, and they can also drive the 4 things above. So they are still connected and tied in. And then there's other factors that are tied to brain health that we look at from holistic perception or perspective. So the brain and how it works, I always, whenever I talk about brain health or mental health, I show these slides just as to set the context. The brain is organized in certain structures in certain regions, and each of them are responsible for carrying out certain functions and behaviors and thoughts. So that structure is made of brain cells, and this is a neuron, but there are many types of brain cells. And so the brain cells have to function properly. You have to have a significant number of them. They have to branch properly. They have to interact properly. The brain is wired, so the brain cells actually wire and they go and they wrap around the brain like the diagram shows there. And each different color in that diagram represents a different type of neurotransmitter. So let's say serotonin neurotransmitter, that neuron that makes serotonin only makes serotonin. We'll have dopamine neurons that make dopamine, and so they wire slightly differently to different regions, and that wiring is important. The membrane of the cell itself is important. So it's about 60% fat, and the fats that you build it with are important to how that membrane works. And I will tell you, most of the function of the brain occurs at the membrane level. So hugely important. So we need to have the proper nutrients to build that, obviously, and so that it works properly. The chemistry in the brain. So we have neurotransmitters, we have hormones, immune system components, many things tied to a properly functioning brain. And so we have to look at that, what makes it go up, what makes it go down. But that is an important function, the way the brain works. And then lastly, all of this stuff has to work together. So the membranes and the neurotransmitters and releasing and binding and all that kind of stuff. This is a diagram of the end of a neuron. And the NE in red there is norepinephrine. And so it's being released from the end of a neuron. And so what we see is that all of that, if you look closely, you'll see vitamins and minerals are tied into that. All of that is nutrient dependent. So you change the nutrition, you change the function. The last is thoughts and perceptions. And so the thoughts and perceptions are a result of or live inside that container of proper function of the brain. And so, if we wire our brain to think a certain way, to repeat a certain thought, then that becomes very easy to do over and over again. And the more we do it, the more we wire towards that. So the thoughts and perceptions can change the function of the brain, but they are also affected by the function of the brain. So there's a few models of brain health. When I was thinking of what 5 am I going to use, what five do I use all the time, I looked at a few other ones. These are a few people from the conference, the IMMH conference. So Chris Kresser, who is a functional medicine ancestral diet expert. His 5 that he presented were sleep, exercise, don't eat too much, don't drink too much, and don't smoke, which seems ridiculously simple and probably wouldn't do much from our perspective. But sadly, people coming to Chris Kresser and working with functional medicine as well, This makes a difference because that's how bad their diets and their lifestyle actually is. And so if you take away those things and make sure you have the sleep and the exercise, you will go a long way to improving brain health. Kenneth Charlin was another presenter, and he presented the functional medicine model that looks like this. You look at nutrition, you look at movement, so exercise and a few other things. Sleep is very important, and stress management, and then also relationships. And so all of those things affect all aspects of physical health, and physical health affects mental, emotional, and spiritual health. So that is the functional medicine model. Dr. Amen basically pulls some risk factors, which tells us the model of what he thinks important. So adequate blood flow, that is actually a big problem. Poor oxygenation is devastating to the brain. A lot of people have that. Dr. Amen says once you stop learning, actively seeking out knowledge, then your brain starts to die. And chronic inflammation. So inflammation is caused by a bunch of things. We're going to look at a few of them, but chronic inflammation changes the way the brain wires, the way the structures are, and it changes the way we do the neurochemistry, and not in a good way. And so genetics, this is very holistic. They only load the gun. What happens to us, like what we do in diet and environmental chemicals, pulls the trigger, allowing whatever genetic component, defect, or whatever you want to call it, allowing it to manifest. Head trauma, this is one of the things that really shocked me, is head trauma is a huge factor. And so Dr. Amen says the brain is a soft organ. It's actually about the consistency somewhere between Jello and raw egg whites. So it is very, very soft. And it's inside a hard skull that has sharp, bony ridges. So any banging or trauma can either bruise or damage or disrupt the brain. And then that shows up as mental health issue, or can show up as mental health issues down the road or even immediately. So then the last one is toxins. And so toxins are very damaging to the brain. You know, the brain uses 25% of all the nutrition, and whatever gets carried in, toxins get carried in with that nutrition, affect the brain negatively. So here's my 5 most important issues as I do in practice. So nutrition, huge important. Remember, the brain is made of nutrients. It can't be made of anything else, right? It has to be what we take in, and its function is dependent on nutrients as well. Digestion and GI tract and microbiome, I group all of those things together because they're all tied. And so how well do you digest the food? How much do you get out of your food? Is the GI tract healthy? Is it inflamed? Is it normal? And then the microbiome. The microbiome is, the definition is all the gut bacteria, yeast, molds, and viruses, and their DNA as well. So because there is a huge body of evidence for correlation between the microbiome and the brain health and the DNA interaction there. We also have toxins, which it comes up over and over and over again. I can tell you, I've yet to see anybody, maybe 1 or 2 people, who did not have toxic load. So the question, people go, how do I know if I have toxins? You really should be starting the other way. How do I know that I don't have toxins? Because the research shows that virtually 95% everybody who lives in North America has a toxic load that's affecting them one way or another. Exercise is really important. I'm going to show you one study for that, and I'm going to show you another study for rest and relaxation. Both of those are a component of brain health. You can't have good brain health without both of those. A lot of people will skip both, and a lot of people will skip the rest and relaxation part, and we can always do it later. Bad idea. And then the last one is sleep. And I've heard that it said that sleep is the fifth most important element of metabolic life. And yes, I tend to agree. So what I did in preparing for this talk is I took all that the compiled information, and I kind of laid it out in a way that I could go through it just to show you the correlation between food and brain health issues. And this is going to be some of the ways that it shows up. So we'll start over here. We got the food, and from the food, we get the macromolecules like protein, fatty acids, cholesterol, carbohydrates, and sugars. And we also get micromolecules, so vitamins and minerals and a few other things. And then we have toxins. We also get toxins from our food. So pesticide residues, herbicides, all that kind of stuff, heavy metals, environmental toxins, and some other things. We'll just leave it at that. And so we're just going to follow that path. The toxins, when they get in the gut, they lead to immune system dysfunction. And so the immune system may become overreactive, more pro-inflammatory, or it may fail to do its role of protecting us from microbes that are in the gut that aren't good for us. So we get the immune malfunctioning, and what that leads to is a microbiome dysfunction. So too many bad guys, we'll say, or yeast and molds and toxins, and that increases oxidative stress on the cells that line the gut. And we get damage from the oxidative stress and then directly from microbial toxins, and then we end up with leaky gut. We follow the leaky gut path. So leaky gut, the definition is microscopic little holes or breaks in the membrane cells or lining of cells that line the gut, and they allow things in that wouldn't normally get in. So leaky gut leads to food allergies because we leak proteins in that we shouldn't have, undigested food or incompletely digested food. We will get gluten and casein issues. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but gluten and casein, if we don't break them down completely, they can be absorbed as opioid-like molecules. So gluteomorphin and casomorphin, they dock opiate receptors in the brain, which for most people is fine, but to a degree. But for people with mental health issues, there is a proportion of them or a subset where the opiates are very bad and they set things off in a bad way. If you have leaky gut, you're just naturally going to leak more toxins in the body, which are naturally going to leak more toxins in the brain. It is now said over and over and over again in orthomolecular circles that leaky gut equals leaky brain, and I see a lot of evidence for that. And then lastly, with leaky gut, you get less nutrients into the body because digestion and absorption happen in an incomplete way, and we need those nutrients for proper brain health. Taking it a little further, looking at infections. So gut infections would be, actually we can do it this way, any infection in the body that gets treated with antibiotics. So we would get the antibiotics, which then go and damage the microbiome. So make the microbiome or the gut a good host for bad guys, especially yeast and molds. And the bad environment for the good guys, the protective guys. So antibiotics can lead down that pathway ultimately to leaky gut. Infections also do other things. So they change nutrient allocation. So example would be tryptophan. I'm going to show you this diagram, but tryptophan that would normally get made into serotonin, when there are infections, it gets made into other things that are not good for us. And so we lose the tryptophan component. And then infections also decrease mitochondrial energy production. Every cell in the body needs energy, and the brain is no exception. So when energy levels drop, it shows up in the brain, and I'll show you some of that coming up too. When we have less energy, we do things like less methylation and sulfation, which means we detox toxins less, and then we get increases in brain toxins. And then the last component here is the genes. So some people have genes that they're predisposed for less mitochondrial function and therefore less energy. So they have a disadvantage that things that bring energy down in other people without issue might be a big problem for them. And then the other things that genes are tied to is decreased methylation and sulfation, which those methylation and sulfation are responsible for a lot of things, but especially detoxification. And methylation is also tied to methylating or activating neurotransmitters. So here we go. The 5 most important issues. I'm going to do some, we'll say, contextual info here. And so 5 most important issues when people have brain illnesses. First one's nutrition, as I alluded. And so this was a presentation by Kenneth Charlin. What's the perfect brain diet? It looks like this. Nutrient dense, has all the essential vitamins, minerals, amino acids. It should also have fatty acids in there. There it is. So anti-inflammatory. So you're looking for anti-inflammatory foods. So high in mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids with a low omega-6 to 3 ratio. Keep in mind, it's a low ratio, not a no ratio. I have had many people over the years come to me with brain health issues, and their omega-3s are, I will say, satisfactory, but their 6s are 0. They're both essential, and you need to have some of those. So that is one of the things I look for. A low carbohydrate, yes, carbohydrates, human body doesn't actually need carbohydrates. They're not essential. We can use them, and we're definitely adapted to use them. But excesses of carbohydrates cause problems. Moderate protein, this is good. The only issue here is the definition of moderate is still being debated, and it'll be debated for quite a while. Perfect brain diet continued, antioxidant rich. So we want vitamins and phytonutrients, alpha lipoic acid, vitamin E, polyphenols, so colors, colored veggies, colored fruits, and things like that, and herbs as well for different compounds. Methylation support, so folate, B12, B6, choline, those kind of nutrients, and detoxification support, so cruciferous vegetables, garlic, parsley, and other greens. You'll see that there is definite overlap between foods that are in one category are also good in other categories. So that's his base protocol. It also says should be plant-based, but omnivorous. So he's a big believer of having animal products in there, especially for the B12, which is a huge issue with mental health issues, especially with vegans who aren't supplementing vitamin B12. Other molecules there, we got the D3, DHA, iron, taurine, and choline. So should be fiber rich. So fibers help suck up toxins, but they also support the gut microbiome. They give it a home, but they also give it some, we'll say, food to thrive on. And the last point that he said is this food, the way he described it, should be consumed mindfully and in the company of others, which is, I've never actually seen that in a diet prescription before, but it makes perfect sense. If you're mindful about the food you're eating, you can't be in fight or flight mode, which shuts down digestion and causes toxicity from the food. And typically when we're in the company of others, I assume means pleasant company of others, then that gets you out of fight or flight. It gets you in the rest and digest mode. And people who eat in the company of others also tend to eat a little slower, which is good for digestion. Another concept when it comes to brain health that it just astounds me when I see this ignored on clients who come to me who've been working with other professionals. But always remember this: vitamin C, magnesium, and B6. Why? Because in order to go from tryptophan to serotonin, you need vitamin C, magnesium, and B6. So the enzymes that do the conversion need those vitamins and minerals. In order to go from tyrosine to dopamine, also serotonin is calm and blissful. Tyrosine makes dopamine, and norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are all tied to focus and clarity. Dopamine also is a calming in the right proportion molecule and promotes happiness. So all important. So to go from tyrosine to dopamine, then down to cascade there, vitamin C, magnesium, and B6. Again, it's the same enzymes actually. And then to go from glutamate to GABA. Glutamate is our excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. So it turns the volume up of neurotransmission. So anxiousness, and GABA turns down that. So it's inhibitory. It turns down the volume of brain activity. So the way we keep balance, so one of the main ways we keep balance of GABA or glutamate to GABA, so we keep the glutamate here and GABA there where it's supposed to be. If it's GABA, the glutamate goes too high, we steal some of that glutamate and make it into GABA to give us the inhibitory effect. So that is hugely important. So vitamin C, magnesium, and B6, you should be thinking that all the time, all the time. Fish oils, so EPA and DHA. And so here's a study, and basically they looked at kids with ADHD, and they gave them high dose EPA and DHA and found significant improvements over 8 weeks. So two things here. It was high dose. I'll show you the dose in a minute. And it was over 8 weeks. A lot of times people will try, I took fish oils for 2 days. I didn't feel anything. And then they go, doesn't work. And then they stop or they look for something else. It can take a while to build up these. Remember, the brain is about that big and it's mostly fat, and the fish oils are this big and they're mostly fat, but the component of EPA and DHA in there is still very, very small. Then it has to go through the body, and so a very small amount of that will get built in, so it takes time. The study they used 10 grams of just the EPA component and almost 5.5 grams of just the DHA component. So to kind of tell you how that would play out, 10 grams would be about 20 capsules of the average fish oil supplement, or 20 teaspoons. So that would be in a day, and this is with kids. What they did though is this is called a loading dose. So they went high initially to populate the cell membranes with the EPA and DHA, mostly DHA. And then once they got to saturation, they lowered it back down. And a typical dose for anxiety and depression is around 2 grams. So that's still the equivalent of 4 caps of fish oils per day. And this is for kids. I'm going to talk about when I was at this conference. So it was 4 days, 8 presentations a day. I went to the lunchtime presentations as well because the content was just so good. I could not justify coming all the way down to San Diego and being there and not watching everything. So intently focused on getting every morsel of information I could out of it. So 100% attention all the time. And by halfway through day 2, so Friday afternoon, lunchtime, I knew I was in trouble because my brain was overwhelmed. And I had just watched several presentations on fish oils. A colleague and I ran off to the closest health food store and I bought a bottle of fish oil. And I did 2 caps every 2 hours throughout the day of the next 2.5 days. And so my focus went up, clarity went up, mood went up. So, I mean, it's like felt great the whole time. And when it wrapped up, I realized that I actually felt better at the end of the conference than I did at the beginning. And I have never had that happen before. So I attribute that to reloading my brain with we'll call loading doses of fatty acids, EPA and DHA, so fish oils. Would I do that forever? No. I would probably take it down. Well, what I do is 2 fish oils a day, which I think is a good dose for most people, unless you have mental health issues, and that's the one context where I definitely approve of going much higher. And I went the wrong way. So here we go. More about fish oils. So cholesterol, let's talk about cholesterol. Hugely important for the brain, has many, many roles. And the important context for this is a lot of medications. Like medicine wants cholesterol levels low to protect you from heart disease. And that's debatable whether it actually does that. But when you take cholesterol lowering meds, you increase your risk of brain health problems. So I guess the question is, do you want to live a long time with no brain function or low brain function, or a short time with good function? It's actually moot because cholesterol is actually good for you. So here's what happens with low cholesterol. We get impaired G protein coupling. G proteins are these molecules that translate, we'll say, information from outside the cell to the inside. So they're very important for regulation and making things happen. So cholesterol, low cholesterol inhibits that. The serotonin 1A receptor, there's a few serotonin receptors, but the 1A receptor becomes less hospitable for serotonin. So there's less binding, so you get less of the positives from serotonin when you're low cholesterol. And it impairs downstream signaling. So once you've activated a serotonin receptor, that action that should happen from that gets reduced when cholesterol is low. So low cholesterol, not good for the brain. So what are the things that the 1A receptor regulates? Temperature, sleep, aggression, anxiety, and eating. So all of those things can be tied to low cholesterol. More stuff. Here's a study on monkeys. The reason it was on monkeys is you can't ethically do this on humans. Monkeys consume low cholesterol diet, were more aggressive, less affiliative, so less socially connected, and lower concentrations of serotonin. So mood and cholesterol. Cholesterol, here's another thing. Cholesterol is required to make oxytocin. And so here is the oxytocin receptor. And here is cholesterol built into that receptor. It's there for function and structure. So without that cholesterol, the receptors are almost completely inactive. And the receptors fall apart at body temperature when there's not enough cholesterol. So what's oxytocin? Oxytocin is the pair bonding, it's also called the cuddling molecule. It gives us a sense of connectedness, and it ties mothers to their babies. I've heard this many, many times. The quote is, oxytocin is the molecule that keeps mothers from killing their babies when they're up at night for the 10th day in a row and haven't had any sleep. So oxytocin, important for mothers, but also everybody else for a sense of connection. Here's a study that was done on cholesterol and cocaine addicts, and they looked at the cocaine addicts that relapsed at 3, 6, and 12 months and measured their cholesterol levels all along. And they found that the people who relapsed had lower cholesterol levels. And yes, cholesterol is required for function of the way the brain works, and it's tied to addiction, not only cocaine, but many, many other things. Now, the mitochondria make energy in the cells, and if you don't have enough energy, then it's kind of like trying to run your car on a poor fuel, and so it knocks at things, or it's trying to run your computer at half the electricity. It's not only not going to work right, it's probably going to damage things. So low energy is destructive in the brain, because first the organelles inside the brain, the cell don't work, and then the cell doesn't work, and then the organ itself, like the brain, doesn't work. So mitochondria are very important. So these are the nutrients that are required for the mitochondria to work properly and make energy. There's two different areas. On the left side are all the things that happen inside the cell, but outside the mitochondria. So we start with glucose or medium chain triglycerides, and then we convert them down into a molecule that can be burned or made into energy. And so look what we need on the outside: glucose and the medium chain triglycerides, acetylcarnitine to get fatty acids into the mitochondria. We need lysine, methionine, serine. The vitamins, the group of vitamins there, folate, trimethylglycine, biotin, and iron, all of those are need to prepare the energy to be burned inside the mitochondria. And then on the right side there, we have all the nutrients that are required to actually convert the fuel into actual energy. And so there is a whole host of nutrients required to make the energy that makes the powers the cells, the power of the brain. I like to talk about multi-nutrient formulas. A lot of research on individual components and brain health, but very little on looking at multi-nutrients. And the reason we look at multi-nutrients is, I don't know if you've seen this, but none of the nutrients act on their own. Every single, like B6 requires the vitamin C and the magnesium, right, to do that job. And so multi-nutrients understudied, but there actually are there's about 30 good studies on multi-nutrients, and brain health. And so we're going to talk about those. I consider, we'll just do it like that. And so here we go. This is a study on a multi-nutrient product called Empower Plus that was used in the study. And basically what they did is, this is somebody who had a traumatic brain injury. So you could consider that the worst of the worst. So traumatic brain trauma. And so what they use is this formula to correct or help the brain heal, essentially. And so what it is if you look at the bottle, I actually dismissed using it for a couple of years because I looked at it and go, it looks like a common multi. And but I kept hearing about the magic it does, especially with traumatic brain injuries, people who are set to be taken off of life support given the product, the multi-nutrient, and having them come out of comas. It's quite remarkable. I heard this over and over and over again over the years. So I did get the opportunity to get a bottle, and somebody gave me a bottle at the conference. I said, sure, I'll take it. And so I tried it myself, felt pretty good. And I gave it to my son, who was, I think, around 14 at the time. And my son likes to draw. And so this is a typical example of what he was drawing at the time. He loves cars and he loves drawing. And so he would basically transcribe what he saw. And he would always transcribe from pictures. And so he copied this picture of this car. And so, I mean, it's not bad. I went to art school. He's not going to art school, but went to art school and I learned perspectives off a little bit, but it's not bad. But then I noticed the little notch in the top of the roof there. So I asked him, what's the notch? And he said, well, it wasn't there in the picture. I said, show me the picture. And so in the picture, the sun was behind the car and all of that, the roof of the car was white, except for that little notch. And so he didn't draw it because he didn't see it. So what we're talking here is direct transcription and no creativity. And so 3 days of just 2 of these pills a day, so the multi-nutrient, the right nutrients in the right proportions, in the right forms that the brain uses, this happens. So he drew this. He read a book about Alcatraz. And so suddenly he does this drawing and it's full of all these components from the book he read. And so now we've gone to 100% creativity. And I'm going to zoom in. So there was somebody who stole a jewel, somebody who had a clock who was timing things. There's like a nice eye there. Somebody killed a priest or bishop or something. And so he incorporated all those things in a creative and complex way. Of course, what do you do as a good parent when you see results like that? You take them off and watch him go back to drawing cars the original way, and then repeat the experiment and watch him go back to drawing this way. The interesting thing is we didn't do that for more than a couple of months, but the effects have held. So that's quite interesting. And so now, years later, we all take it. It's just typical for our family. Diet and brain health. So this is Dr. Amen. 50% of mental health issues are due to a terrible diet. So remember, he's seen over 160,000 people. You can infer a lot of things by looking at diet. So for him to say 50% terrible diet, I would tend to agree. I might actually put it a little higher for the people I work with. So this is from Julia Matthews, who's a nutritionist down in the US, and she is heavily into autism and helping people with autism, diet. And so here's a list of things, the diets that she uses with people with autism, not all the time, but it also gives us clues to some of the things that cause autism and other mental health issues. So gluten and casein are big ones. A paleo diet is effective. So what does this mean? High fat and relatively good protein, but very low carbohydrate. Ketogenic, the same. Paleo is just a little more on the protein side and more on the meat side. Allergenic free, grain, starch free, yes, because there's more to grain and starches than just the gluten component. Elimination diets, rotation diets to address the allergy component. Then there's FODMAPs, which stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, these little compounds that we can do poorly with, or the brain can do poorly with under certain conditions. And then we have the other list of other things that affect the brain that you can take them out of the diet and see improvement, and that'll give you some clues. The last one on the list is oxalates. And so factors that promote high oxalates, and oxalates are these tiny little molecules that, if they don't get processed properly, they form microscopic crystals inside heart muscle, cardiovascular tissue, the kidneys, and also in the brain. So razor sharp crystals inside the brain doesn't sound like a good idea. And there is definitely a correlation between that and health problems, especially in the brain. So eating high oxalate foods, this one kind of made me laugh because he mentioned the two worst offenders are spinach and almonds. And he goes, it's funny because you get all these people eating spinach and almonds because they're superfoods and they're the best thing out there and they think they're healthy. And for some of them, it's going to actually be taking them down. It's be the worst thing they could be doing. Actually, the speaker, he said that I don't even feed, or spinach is not even good enough to feed to my rabbits. And later that evening, I was talking to Dr. Greenblatt, and I told him that's what he said. And he said, well, I feed spinach to my rabbits. So I think there is some give and take on that issue still. But other things that promote high oxalates, mold yeast, molds and yeast exposures, B6 deficiencies for sure, and then genetics. It could be that the last 3 points there make you susceptible to the first point. And we also got to look at digestion. So it's the second main factor there, digestion, the GI tract and microbiome. And so here's an example of why it's important. We take in tryptophan as an amino acid, and then it goes through the pathway. Normally we make it to serotonin. We're going to leave the B6 part out, but with dysbiosis, too many bad guys, or yeast and molds, that tryptophan gets made into toxins, some of which are toxic to the brain. So not good. Another way that tryptophan gets converted into something not good in a inhospitable GI tract or with dysbiosis, tryptophan, if you got the infection going on down there because of the dysbiosis or as concurrent with it, we take that tryptophan and make it into quinolinic acid. What's quinolinic acid? It's a tryptophan derivative, so you take that molecule and you change it a whole bunch of times. And why is it important? Because that final quinolinic acid inhibits acetylcholine production. Acetylcholine is required for muscle contractions and focus and balance in the brain. It increases glutamate conversion to GABA, so more excitatory. Oh, it inhibits that, right? It inhibits glutamate conversion to GABA, so more excitatory and less conversion of that into the inhibitory, so pro-anxiety. It's an NMDA receptor agonist. The NMDA receptor is this receptor that activates stuff on cells or activities from cells, sits in the cell membrane. The right amount of activity is good for us, very beneficial, and too much of it is damaging. It can take us into excitatory states and worse. And quinolinic acid, as quinolinic acid, is a neurotoxin, so it kills brain cells. And so what makes more of that? LPS, so lipopolysaccharide. This is a polysaccharide component, so we'll just leave it at that. It's a molecule that is in the outer membranes of certain types of bacteria, and as these bacteria die, they shed this, and as part of their normal life, or even if you go and kill these guys off dramatically, you get increases lipopolysaccharide, which then increases the conversion of tryptophan down into quinolinic acid. Elevated cortisol does the same thing, and other inflammatory markers or inflammatory compounds, cytokines, increase quinolinic acid production. Also tied to what goes on in the brain, tied to mental health, is dopamine. And so dopamine metabolism is one of the things we do all the time, and I'm going to show you how it works. We get from food, we get something called dopa. It comes from tyrosine. could say it's there. And then that gets converted by some enzymes down into dopamine. And then dopamine has two pathways. Some of it goes into making HV and some of it goes across and gets made into norepinephrine, and some of that will get degraded down to epinephrine as needed. So that is the pathway. If we run the pathway like that, everything stays in balance. Now, problem. So we got dysbiosis. We have bad things going on in the gut. We got something called C. difficile infections. That could be in the gut. But here's what happens with the C. difficile. It blocks the conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine. So we need to make dopamine into norepinephrine for balance. If we block that, we have a problem. And I'll show you that in a second. Also, other Clostridia species will cause, they basically release compounds that also inhibit this enzyme, dopamine beta hydroxylase. And so then what happens is we back up dopamine, we get too much. So too much dopamine can make things go bad, increases paranoia, I believe, and psychotic issues, makes all of those things worse. One of the contributing factors to schizophrenia and a bunch of other mental health issues. So that's the dopamine. So that's all tied to dysbiosis in the gut. The third important factor is toxins, and I'm just going to give a few examples here, a little bit of specifics. So herbicides, pesticides, all are damaging to the brain. This is a herbicide, and what does it do? It uncouples oxidative phosphorylation. That is how we make energy. So in the study, in this article, they basically said that herbicides decrease the function of succinic dehydrogenase. And so there is a picture of complex 2 inside the mitochondria, inside the mitochondrial membrane there. I'm going to expand on this in a second. And complex 2 is required to make ATP, our energy batteries. And so that's it on the top there, making energy batteries process. And down here is what's called the Krebs cycle, so required for that. And so I've made a weird looking diagram, but here we go. So you know the Krebs cycle, this is it. This is how we take glucose up here and ultimately convert it to ATP. There's an enzyme in that process, and that's called succinate dehydrogenase, the one I was just talking about. And here is the mitochondrial membrane with the electron transport chain, and complex 2 is high in that succinase dehydrogenase, and so both components are required to make energy inside the cell are inhibited by herbicides. So there's a mechanism of action. We know how it works, and then we see that it works. Another factor that's important for the brain and in excess is considered a toxin is homocysteine. Homocysteine, we make it from methionine, so it's a protein amino acid. We use it throughout the body. As we use it, it gets made into homocysteine, and then if we have proper nutrients, we can convert it back to methionine. But if not, there's a couple factors that make us build up the homocysteine. Homocysteine is toxic to brain cells. It's damaging. So there is a genetic component which can affect up to 20% of the population, certain populations. And so the genetic component is what are called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're mutation in the genes, these ones, the MTHFR, the MTR, and a couple other ones. So genes that are tied to methylation, we can have SNPs for those, and so those proteins don't work as well. But from the nutritional side, we can also go high homocysteine, being low in folate, B12, B6, B2, riboflavin, betaine, and methyl B12. All of those were needed to properly do methylation, and so deficiencies can cause those problems. And so, yes, Dr. Shaw likes the B12 form, methylated form of B12, because not only does it participate in converting homocysteine back into methionine by enzyme processes, it also directly methylates without having enzymes. So this is why methyl B12 is considered the best methyl form for the brain. This is from Dr. Pizzorno, who wrote one of our textbooks. He's considered one of the world's experts on toxicity now and toxins and detoxification. He says, according to his best estimate, this is where toxins come from: 6% from food, 10% from water, and 10% house and yard chemicals, and then 10% beauty aids, 5% from the air. So one of the things you should notice right off the bat is every single one of those things is modifiable behaviors, right? We can change every single one of those. And yeah, it's just a matter of knowing about toxins and detoxification. I would say from my experience, I would rate the health and beauty aids as a bigger toxin, probably around 20 to 25% for most people that I run across. And then the food would stay the same. So, right. So there is significant clinical or epidemiological, so health study research supporting neurotoxin exposure. So neurotoxin exposure, these toxins I've been talking about, tied to ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, ALS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cognitive decline, dementia, even chronic headaches or immediate headaches, IQ loss, especially in children, but I've also seen that in adults, especially with lead, and mood disorders and motor neuron disorders. So that's a broad range of things that are caused or tied to toxins that would never typically get addressed by the mainstream medical approach. So it's always nice to say this causes this, but if you can say how, it's even better. So how does how do neurons get damaged by toxins? Directly neurotoxic. So touches the cell, kills it, or gets in the cell, kills it. Increases oxidative stress and more free radical production, especially with the metals, the heavy metals. Microglial activation. So microglial cells are the other cells other than neurons, or one of those components, and you can make them pro-excitatory, or basically you can make them behave inappropriately with toxins, and that sets off the whole cascade. Damage to mitochondria, less energy, less function of the cells. Deplete methyl groups, because we use them to detox. So if you're using all your methyl groups to detox, they're not going to be there to activate neurotransmitters and other things, deactivate homocysteine. And decrease production of BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. So BDNF is called miracle grow for the brain. So basically what causes the growth of neurotransmitters, receptors, more branching of neurons, which is good. And so it's a very important component. And so that goes down with toxin exposure. Other things that are toxic are drugs. Virtually every med I've ever researched decreases nutrients and therefore decreases function of the body. But drugs also play a role here. So we got benzodiazepines and metformin, the diabetes drug, and the anticholinergics, which are molecules that decrease cholesterol. So basically all the things that we need get taken down. So there we go. So medications increase that risk of dementia. You could actually follow the pathway and see right down to the molecular level. A lot of it is by being pro-inflammatory ultimately. And so the good news is several anti-inflammatory vitamins and minerals and herbals, components are shown to decrease the risk of dementia with people taking those meds. This is from Dr. Amen, and so if you look at I'll just circle it right here. This is a healthy brain looking from the top down, and so it is smooth. This is a SPECT scan, and so damage to the brain shows up as areas of inactivity, and so the more modeled the brain is, the less healthy it is. And so this is his diagram from the conference comparing the effects of certain drugs and how they show up. And he said, well, I think he said opiates are the biggest one. They're the worst one. They cause the most damage. But marijuana is the second most brain toxic nutrient you could, or drug you can put in your body from the recreational side. So that's kind of shocking, especially in light of opening up the world to, Canadian world to marijuana. It is not without risk. I know it has benefits, but it's not without risk. So, and of course, the damage can be tied to increased susceptibility. So maybe people who are fully saturated with their nutrients and things will get less damage from marijuana or other drugs than other people. But drugs, so medical drugs and recreational drugs, both that cause brain problems. So still on the context of toxins, here's a study from Dr. Pizzorno, and so that he cited basically eating organically grown foods dramatically that decreases neurotoxins. And so basically tenfold decrease in persistent organic pollutants. Wait, hold on, sorry. They studied people and they found that this was children in Seattle, tenfold increase of the persistent organic pollutants in people with ADHD, so kids with ADHD. So there's a smoking gun there. So what they found, so they took these people or these kids and they gave them 100% organic food, organic grown foods, so plant foods. And they saw a measurable drop in 3 days. So 3 days. So there's two things to this. One, it shows that if you take the toxins out, then the toxins go down. Remember the saying, you can't dry off in the shower. And so if you constantly have a constant onslaught of toxins, your body is going to have a struggle getting rid of them because you're still getting them. The other thing about this is it shows that if eating organic removes toxins quickly, eating non-organic increases toxins quickly, and it's persistent. So this is a happy and horrifying slide at the same time. One of the last speakers who I went to see at this conference was Dr. Chandra, and she talked about Lyme disease and other parasites. The thing that got me was I was sitting in a room with 150 psychiatrists and psychologists, and maybe just one or two others. I was one of the others as a nutritionist. And so here we have professional psychologists and psychiatrists. Thing that blew my mind was they were all here learning a better way. They're learning the say holistic and integrative way to address these things. So that was really cool. But then she went on to talk about Lyme disease and other infections that people get. And so basically her talk was about how this shows up in the body, and virtually everything tied to mental health could be tied to one of these infections or associated with it. Talked about how to diagnose it and treatments for it. Very, very extensive, but it was horrifying. So I'm going to show you things that are tied to Lyme and other parasites. So depression, mood swings, psychosis, violent behavior, irritability, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, panic attacks, sleep disorders, having seizures, ADHD or like symptoms, autism like symptoms, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. So here's the question: how many times would the psychiatrist, the mainstream psychiatrist or doctor, consider parasite infection with these conditions? I can say from mainstream, from what I have seen, virtually zero. It doesn't even come up on the radar. So here's a case report that she presented. So here is a boy who had basically, he had sudden onset hallucinations, delusions, suicidal, homicidal ideations. So perfectly normal kid, bang, suddenly all this happens. So the family spent $400,000 on medical testing. The kid ended up in the psych ward for 6 weeks. And so then that got in touch with somebody who knew about the parasites in Lyme. They tested them and they resolved everything with antibiotics in a short period of time. Can you imagine if you never got tested for the parasitic infection, that kid would still be on drugs today? And that's horrifying. So here's the quote that got me. In fact, normally I write these quotes verbatim, but I was so shocked, and it was the last thing she said that I forgot to write it down. And so the quote is, if you're paraphrased, if you're a psychiatrist or psychologist working with someone who has neuropsychiatric issues and you don't test for Lyme and other parasites, I consider that malpractice. That was astounding. Yeah, so that changed the way I looked at a lot of people that I work with. So point number 4, exercise and relaxation, just a couple points for each, or one for each. Exercise, why is it valuable? Activates the endocannabinoid system. And endocannabinoids, the same thing that marijuana activates, and a couple other, say, recreational drugs, and activates it in a good way. That system is involved in pain management and mood, a bunch of other stuff. So according to this study, they said that exercise is the best value in medicine. So that means if you've got options of drugs and treatments, and I don't know if they consider nutrition, but you're going to get your biggest bang for a buck by getting people to look at exercise. And exercise increases BDNF again. And so the author of that study said that is probably what that runner's high is, a sudden increase in BDNF, doing all its good things in the brain. And so benefits of regular exercises: reduces insulin resistance. The brain, when it runs on glucose, is highly dependent on having that glucose get in. Insulin resistance decreases the amount of glucose, but it also raises the amount of insulin, and insulin is pro-inflammatory and damaging to the brain. Exercise increases ketosis, so helps us make ketone bodies, which have beneficial protective effects in the brain. Also increases BDNF. Increases the size of the hippocampus, so one of the most beneficial regions of the brain for mental health, and so increases size. That is good. Improves vascular function, so increases blood flow to the brain, which brings more oxygen, which means more energy, so all good stuff. Helps reduce stress and helps reduce inflammation. It's good for sleep and survival of newborn neurons. So we are growing neurons all the time, and as we grow them, this protects them, or exercise increases their chances of surviving into adulthood, we'll say. And then exercise improves mood. So the next part is stress. So R&R, this is stress prevention, and so, or mediation. So things we can do: meditation, shown highly effective. Pattern breathing, things like breathe in for 3, breathe out for 6. Those things, they take you out of fight or flight mode. You can't deep breathe and be in fight or flight mode at the same time. So once you get into it. So there we go. We got the yoga, Tai Chi, these body movement things, shown benefit. Reiki, and music and sound therapy. So just picking the right sound, or the right music, the right tempo can be quite beneficial to get stress down. Study I came across, this was from 2019 presentation, but it is quite relevant today, isn't it? Association of higher cortical amyloid burden with loneliness in cognitively normal adults. So you take people who have normal brain function and you make them lonely by locking them down or whatever, and the amyloid that is secreted in the brain, the amount of that increases. Normally we can deal with the normal amount, but if we increase it, we increase these little particles in the brain cells, and then they increase destruction of the brain, and then ultimately it declines down to mental decline. So loneliness, one of the worst things you can do to people. And here's the quote, social isolation activates the same area of the brain that's tied to intense physical pain. So these are the worst things we could be doing to ourselves and our elderly. This is therapeutic guidelines for preventing cognitive decline in older adults. And so moderate, intense activity like brisk walking for 2.5 hours a week and doing muscle strengthening exercises 2 or more days a week. So I just put that up there to go so that you can look at it and go, well, are my people doing this or am I doing this as one of my ways of preventing cognitive decline? When I work with clients, virtually none of them get that much exercise. So here's another checklist, we'll say, from Dr. Raymond, anti-anxiety strategies to try before medications. This would be anti-anxiety, but it also applies to depression, other conditions as well. These are kind of the underlying factors for brain issues. Hypoglycemia, so you look for that. Anemia, low iron. Iron's needed to make energy. Low thyroid is another one. Thyroid hormone regulates everything in the body, metabolism rate, all kinds of stuff, but is especially important in the brain. Meditation is something else to try. Slow, deep belly breathing. I already talked about that. Hypnosis, guided imagery. Those work well with some people and not so well with other people. It's all a process. So you try things. If they work, you continue. If they don't work, you go on to something else. Calming exercise. So exercise that doesn't stimulate you to too much adrenaline and things like that. So more of the calming stuff. Kill the ants. So automatic negative thoughts. These are the thoughts that repeat over and over and over again in the brain. You don't make them, you don't actually bring them up. They're always there, or they come there at certain times. And so Dr. Amen says you got to get a handle on those one way or another and start turning them off. One of the ways I have found personally and with clients that works is when the automatic thought comes up, you go, yes, thank you for sharing, but not relevant because, and if you use that kind of formula, incrementally, bit by bit, you get on your way to changing them. There are other ways to get rid of them, like hypnosis and tapping. And so there we go. And then supplements, so theanine, GABA, magnesium. There's a whole slew of things for getting anxiety down, but also, other things. So last component here, number 5, is sleep. Less than 6 hours of sleep increases the risk of anxiety, panic attacks, depression, car accidents, marital trouble, and obesity. I once went 72 hours without sleeping, then did a presentation, and for I think it was 8 hours, something like that. And seeing double, the whole works, crazy. So it's nice to see firsthand what other people are experiencing, but once is enough. Okay, so yes. So when people have anxiety, how often do they get asked about sleep or car accidents? Well, let's not do that one. Car accidents because of the lack of the inability to stay alert. Marital trouble, how often does a marriage counselor go, how much sleep are you getting, right? So things to keep in mind. Increased risk with poor sleep. What causes more risk of not sleeping well? Having gadgets in bed. So you really shouldn't have a TV or computer in your bed. That rapid eye movement of looking things inhibits sleep. The eye needs to slow down for you to drop into that brain state. Doom and gloom news before bed. Is there any other kind nowadays? But if you have to look at it, before bed is not the best time. Causes disturbing stuff. Fight or flight is not congruent with falling asleep. And then Dr. Amen says easy access to sleeping pills, so being easily prescribed. And the sleeping pills can work temporarily, but they do not fix the underlying context, and then they add to the underlying context. Last 2 points, I believe. This is Dr. Amen. Undiagnosed brain injuries are a major cause of psychiatric illness, depression, panic attacks, ADHD, drug and alcohol abuse, suicide can all be tied to brain injuries, and they don't even have to be bad. I have, and here's the disturbing thing, Dr. Amen showed a case study where the woman had the brain injury when she was 6, and 40 years later, the effects are still there. They weren't corrected. I've seen that as well with brain injuries 10 years prior. So yeah, you always got to ask about brain injuries if they got them. If you want to know more about the brain injuries, definitely look at one of Dr. Amen's books. The brain finishes developing around 25 to 26 years of age. Dr. Amen goes, how do you know that? Because that's the age where male car insurance drops, because they know that the brain is matured by that point. For us, we need to understand the brain starts developing inside the womb and finishes developing 25 or 26 years later. So the entire time it is developing and building structures and chemistry and wiring, it is highly susceptible to all the things I just talked about: nutrient deficiencies, toxins, and other things, lack of sleep, lack of exercise. And so this is the other thing Dr. Amen says, and it says, with setbacks, be curious, because there will always be setbacks when you're working with people. Don't get furious, and don't get judgmental. So consider the process for getting somebody out of their brain health problems as an informed trial and error process. And with everything that happens, both positive and negative, that's a piece to build that puzzle, right? Of what process are we going to do? So, yeah, I've been doing this for probably my entire career. It's like, oh, this went bad, which happens from time to time. And it's like, okay, what can we learn from that? What does that mean? And then we go from there. And then ultimately you get where you want to go. So the 5 most important issues that are important for brain health: nutrition, that digestion, GI tract cascade there, toxins, exposures, exercise and relaxation, and sleep. So that concludes my talk. If you found that interesting, and you found maybe you want to know more about this, I am teaching the clinical ed nutrition and mental health, or the continuing ed nutrition and mental health. I think it's starting in like 2 weeks, or just under 2 weeks. And in this course, we go through pretty much everything I talked about and then expand it like crazy. So I built the course this way: basic understanding of how things work, preliminary understanding of how things don't work, and then we look at all the contributors, all the factors in causing mental health issues, and then we look at all the modulators, the things that modulate, so improve the way the brain works. And we tie that into most of the main health issues, the main mental health issues: anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, ADHD, all of those and a few more. And so basically we build a model of how to address all of those. And the course is 7 weeks. I think it's 3.5 hours a night. It's on Wednesdays. And yeah, it's going to be online. And yeah, so if you're interested, you might want to check that out. And if you want to know more about me, you can visit my website, healthybyknowing.com, although I've been too busy to update it in the last 2 years. But the good news is I still have good relevant articles. You might enjoy reading the one called Do Vitamins Kill People? It's me tearing down a clinical paper and article that came out of it called Do Vitamins Kill People? And it'll give you some understanding of what's going on behind the scenes and why people consider nutrition to be bad, drugs to be good. So that's basically it. If you have any, if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at paul@healthybyknowing.com. And that wraps us up.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us about nutrition and mental health. This is such an important topic and very relevant to what we're experiencing today. I have a couple of questions for you. So now more than ever before, the awareness around nutrition and mental health is exploding. What do you think are the factors that led to this awareness?
Well, that's an interesting one. So what do I think are factors that made more people aware? I think, it's a gradual increase in awareness, I will say, from talking to people. And so recommendations and firsthand peer-to-peer, the discussion of that. There is a little bit more in mainstream media, although still virtually none compared to what it should be. And I think more desperation. I think more and more people are getting fed up and looking outside. Most people I work with have been on drugs for 5 to 10 years, and they see the cascade of getting worse, worse, and worse, and they just say, enough's enough, I'm going to look somewhere else, and then they find holistic approaches.
Okay, that's wonderful. And do you know if you'll be facilitating next year's 51st Annual Orthomolecular Conference?
Will I be facilitating that? We don't know how it's going to go. It's all dependent on powers beyond us, I'll say. But if we can, we are absolutely hoping to do it live in Toronto. And if we can't, then we will more than likely do it like this when we just finished online.
Okay, that's amazing. Well, we do have 2 of your lectures highlighting important topics discussed at the conference available for our alumni membership from our IHN guest speaker series. And we're always amazed by the amount of information that you share with us. And we are very fortunate to have you as a part of the CNP family and on the faculty team. We're so excited for your continuing education course to begin on July 7th. So thank you to all of the attendees for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in Paul's upcoming course. And thank you so much, Paul, for lecturing today.
You're quite welcome.